talking about in class on Thursday last week. All right, good. So I've handed out the notes that I didn't have for you on Thursday in case you want to add that to your collection along with the notes for today. And homework 6 you can take until tomorrow at 4 with that one. Remember that tomorrow is the Career Expo. So I'd encourage you to go over to the Student Center at 3 o'clock for that. I think many of you have class at 4. So an hour is probably plenty of time to circulate around the Career Expo. And as a reminder, our class 2 days from today, so on Thursday, we're going to be over in Drinko Library 349. We'll be listening to a civil engineering faculty member giving a presentation in Drinko Library, and that'll be our class. So are there any questions related to the announcements? Okay. So by a raise of hands, how many have you ever heard of the phrase bridge to nowhere? Have you ever heard of bridge to nowhere? It was kind of a big issue back in 2015 when there was a proposal to connect the town of Ketchikan, Alaska to the airport in Ketchikan, which is on an island called Gravina Island. And ordinarily, to get from the mainland, well actually I think they're both islands, but to get from the main part of Ketchikan to the airport, people have to take ferries. But it was proposed that, you know, it would be more convenient for people instead of having to wait for the ferry. What if there was a road that connected to a bridge that would cover the distance between the two islands, and then a road would take people over to the international airport. So the proposed cost was nearly $400 million. It was the sort of thing where the initial cost was $200, but then construction delays caused material prices to go up, so it went to $275 million, and then they did an environmental study and realized that they had to put in a couple of bridges for wildlife to go under, and then they realized that there was a marshy area. They had to reinforce the foundation of the road so it could go over tundra, and then they needed to go under part of the airport with the road. So just the cost estimate kept getting higher and higher and higher. And it was largely going to be built with federal funds. And it was, it ultimately became what was like the poster child for what's described as pork barrel spending. And I don't know specifically why they call it pork barrel spending, but what it means is federal spending that isn't really justified based on the merits of a project, but really it's just kind of politicians giving in to a powerful colleague who wants something specific. And so like the Senate, for example, wanted the votes of the Alaska delegation on a certain thing, so they said, well, we'll give you this $400 million bridge. You know, it can be, sometimes today instead of pork barrel spending, they call it earmarks. And officially, earmarks are supposed to be dead, but the reality is that they're starting to come back. That federal spending that isn't really justified based on the merits of the project is increasingly happening anyway. And so what that means is that projects are going forward that are unjustified. Contractors or project participants are being selected by the strength of their congressional delegation rather than the strength of their qualifications. And it's, you know, like for us being engineer and technically minded people, and I mean just a basic sense of fairness, it should kind of offend your sense of efficiency when less efficient projects get selected, or when people are doing work that aren't the most qualified for it, but simply that some politician was able to pull strings. It's kind of unseemly, I think. And this is maybe an illustration. You can see here's a photo of, ultimately, this $398 million bridge wasn't built. It was maybe too obviously useless, because the amount of time that would be saved was negligible. You know, the ferry, you can see the airport's just right across from the city itself. So the ferry was effectively quicker, cheaper. It was a better option. This was just unjustified spending. But the government had already granted the money for the road. They never did build the bridge part of it, but they did build the road, because the government had already allocated $28 million to the state of Alaska to build the road. And the governor at the time said, well, if we don't spend it, we have to give it back, so let's just build this road anyway, even though it's not used today. They didn't pave it. It's just a gravel road that literally connects nothing. You know, it stops at the water, and because it's gravel and it doesn't go anywhere, there's no subdivisions on either side of it. There's no exits, no on-ramps or off-ramps. It's just a gravel road that they spent $28 million to go 3.2 miles, and it accomplishes nothing. So this is an illustration of why benefit cost analysis should be implemented, is because without any kind of objective criteria, it's easy for politicians to use all sorts of like vague aphorisms like, oh, we're building the economy, we're serving the hardworking people of Alaska, and you know, they'll use flowery language to justify things that don't have an objective value. And if you rigorously apply benefit to cost analysis, you won't build a bridge to nowhere, and you won't construct a road to nowhere. And public funds that were taken from people who are paying their taxes can be used for other things. Because even though the state of Alaska didn't spend this $28 million, it's not Alaskan money. It came from the federal government. I mean, that money could have been used for something else. Even if it was in Alaska, they could have spent that money on something that actually achieved some value, because zero value. The only value that people got from this project is obviously the contractors who built the road had a financial benefit. And if you're thinking maybe skeptically or with a little bit of cynicism, you may think, well, maybe this was just a project to benefit the contractors more than to benefit people. That's what it kind of looks like. So it's kind of an interesting case study. Here's just another view of the road. You can see this is Ketchikan, and here's the airport, and then here's the road to nowhere. There's no houses on either side. It just goes through this really kind of difficult, wet, marshy area, and it stops. They don't plan to build the bridge there, and they knew it. When they built the road, they knew that the bridge wasn't going to be built. It's not like they built the bridge and then it's not like they built the road and then the bridge got canceled. They knew while they were building the road and even beforehand that this bridge is never going to be built, but they just went ahead anyway and wasted the money on it. So I don't know why it bothers me so much, but it really does. I guess it's just, because I've paid taxes before, and because I know B2C analysis. I know, like, the decision criteria is supposed to be the sum of the benefits exceed the sum of the costs. And in this case, that's certainly not true. So just to review, this is the conventional B2C formula that we talked about in class on Thursday. And it says that here in the numerator, what we're doing is we're totaling up the benefits. And does anybody remember what D stands for in the numerator of this formula? Disbenefits. Good. So what's an example of a disbenefit? Traffic during construction. That's really good. It's the sort of thing that it's not an expense, not like kind of a direct expense. Here in the denominator, the costs are usually pretty easy to quantify. But disbenefits are usually non-monetary side effects of a project, or you can think of it as the side effects of a project that the funding agency doesn't have to bear. Because the people who have to deal with the disbenefits are usually the people who live in the vicinity of the project, or who are in some other way going to be inconvenienced or disadvantaged by it, whether it's impacts to their health, noise, delay. So it's the unintended consequences, the unfavorable consequences. So that's D, disbenefits. And then what does M and O stand for?
Operation and maintenance.
That's right. So the M is maintenance, O is operation. So what that's implying is that this C, M, and O is a recurring expense. So you can think of this as normally, if we're going to draw a cash flow diagram, this is going to be an annual series because it's a recurring, ongoing cost of operations, whereas C sub I is the initial construction costs. And it may not be just only in 1 year. You know, in the case of a bridge or a road or a dam, some really big projects oftentimes will take multiple years to construct, and it's okay if we lump all of those into the initial construction costs. They don't have to be in just at time zero as they occur in real world, but for us to calculate a benefit cost ratio, all of the terms need to be in the same time frame. So that means we have to take all of the benefits to time zero, for example, and the benefits typically will accrue over the life of the project. So they're usually annual as well. In the same way that maintenance and operation are annual, so are benefits. Now, disbenefits, they might be clustered towards the front part of a project, you know, during the construction period, but some of them won't be. If you think about building a dam and flooding some area, the people whose homes were taken, those disbenefits may occur over the entirety of somebody's lifetime. Or if somebody's health is going to be damaged, those health effects could be disbenefits that are over a lifetime. So sometimes disbenefits are like the delay in the construction that are temporary, but some disbenefits can be permanent or at least longer term. All right, so that's just a review of benefit cost analysis. And do you remember the decision criteria is that B to C should be greater than 1 for a project to be justified. At least it should be 1. It should be equal to or greater than 1. And what this means is, since we're going to try to monetize each term here, that means that the numerator is going to be $1 of benefit. When we have the benefits and subtract out the financial aspect of the disbenefits, then what's left in the numerator is dollars of benefit, and then in the denominator it's going to be dollars of cost. And so you shouldn't spend $1 to get less than $1 in return. And so if we go back to this bridge, they spent $28 million. That's the initial construction cost, and the numerator is 0. So there's no benefits. Nobody's using the road. So I think it would be tricky to try and claim that there's benefits. In fact, it may be negative, because I think it would be probably easy to make the argument that it's having environmental effects on wildlife. You know, habitat was taken, that wetlands area was affected. So there are disbenefits, but I don't think there's any benefits in the case of that bridge. All right, so today what we're going to do is consider what happens when there's more than one alternative that you can select. Remember the phrase mutually exclusive alternatives? It means you may find yourself in a situation when you're only going to choose one option, but there's multiple options available to choose from. And it's unlikely that all of those options are the same price. And it's unlikely that all of those options exist over the same time frame. And so we have to use some sort of a technique to compare the alternatives. And so just using flood control as an example, here's a picture of a concrete flood wall. That's one way to provide flood protection. If you've got a river nearby and the water levels of the river rise and fall, and sometimes they're very high, you can protect the property on one side of the flood wall from the effects of the river on the other side of the flood wall by just having this barrier in between that prevents the water from getting into the valuable area. That's one alternative for flood protection. Another would be raising houses, so that if the water level rises, the damageable property is above the level that the water is likely to be. And so in a situation like this, this isn't obviously the permanent fix. They're just temporarily raising the house, and then they're going to build some sort of a modified foundation underneath it. But I've seen structures like this both in Florida, and actually there's a few of them around here where the houses are just very obviously raised up so that they're not going to be affected by flooding. In Milton, there are a couple of relatively new duplexes that are built on really tall cinder blocks so that they have garages down at the level that's likely to be flooded. And then when the water level rises, people hopefully could just drive their car to high ground and the water level will get into their basement, but that's relatively inexpensive repair, just maybe getting the mud out of the basement because it's just cinder block down there. But then the habited levels that have carpet and drywall and furniture and everything is above where the water level is. So this is one alternative, flood walls. Another could be using pumps to try and control the level of water. And so if we wanted to compare these alternatives and decide which one to do, they're all going to have different benefits, different disbenefits, different costs. And so we can apply this consideration of each one of them to be acceptable has to have a B to C of greater than 1. But the best option isn't necessarily the one with the highest B to C ratio. Do you remember when we did incremental rate of return analysis? What we did was we did an analysis where, remember the highest IRR isn't necessarily the best project. We had an illustration that showed that. Let's see, when were we talking about the incremental analysis?
IRR is higher on the increment.
Yeah, it was.
Like the more expensive.
Exactly. So here's that comparison where we were going to do project A versus project B. And it turned out, I think, that project A had the higher IRR, but project B gave you more profits. And what we learned from this is it's better to earn a lower interest rate on a bigger amount of money because you still end up with more profits in the end. So there's kind of like a parallel thinking between this incremental rate of return analysis and what we're going to do with incremental benefit cost analysis. Here, the rule was keep choosing the more expensive alternative as long as the rate of return on the increment is greater than the MAR. And so you did the in-class exercise where we were comparing lots of different alternatives, and we kept choosing the more expensive option as long as the return that we got on the difference exceeded the minimum. Okay, now, in the case of benefit cost analysis, we're going to have a similar rule. And what we're going to do is we're going to compare for each alternative, like comparing raising the house to the flood wall. We'll look at what's the difference in cost between the two. So delta C sub I is just what's the difference in the initial construction cost. We'll find out what's the difference in maintenance and operation between the two alternatives, the difference in benefits between them, the difference in disbenefits. And then we'll put these things into this formula to find out what is the ratio of benefits to cost on the increment. And then our rule will be we'll choose the more expensive alternative as long as the incremental benefit cost ratio is greater than 1. So it may have a lower absolute B to C ratio, but the best alternative is the one that gives you the most value. So our method is going to be, we're going to calculate delta B, delta D, delta C, and so on, and put it into either the conventional or the modified formula. And then when the benefit cost of the increment is greater than 1, then we choose the more expensive of the two alternatives. And I'll call that the one that we've selected. Our book called, we don't have a book in this class, but a book that I've used in the past calls it the Defender, the option that is the is the best of the two alternatives. And then when we have subsequent matchups, we have a challenger that is like the next alternative that we're considering. And anytime the benefit cost is less than 1 on the increment, then the more expensive option is not justified. So I think it is similar in a lot of ways to the incremental analysis that we've done before. Now, here is, let me pull it up on the screen and also hand it out to you, the in-class exercise we're going to use today. I've put a template file on Blackboard. So if you've got your computer, which hopefully you do, if you go to Blackboard, let me show you the template file that we're going to use today. I just put it together to save you the trouble of having to format the column titles and so on. I think it'll just allow us to jump more into the math and the method rather than getting hung up on formatting. So it is at the bottom of our class page, template incremental B2C analysis. So download it, open it, and then the here we go. Let me give you the handout for this in-class exercise.
Did you already?
I think so. I gave you the homework.
Is there only one problem?
There's only one problem on the homework.
Oh, I thought that was in class.
No.
What's the catch? Where we at else?
Well, why is there only one? I guess it's because the homework you're doing right now is kind of lengthy and covers several different topics. This was the only one left over. And then the other catch is that we're going to be doing that kind of guest lecture thing on Thursday, so we won't be covering any like specific course-related content.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So I don't think there's any catch.
I knew we had a project. I didn't know if that was.
No, I haven't assigned the project yet, so it's not because you should be working on the project. Okay. So let's look at this in-class exercise. What we have is 4 different options for flood control. Now, notice that some of these things are already at the present, and some of them are annual amounts. So we know that each of these options is going to last for 75 years. Option A, option B, option C, D. It doesn't tell us what those options are, but I mean, you could imagine that maybe option A is flood proofing. Maybe option B is building a flood wall. Maybe option C is raising every structure. And maybe option D is a dam. So each one of them has different costs on an annual maintenance and operation basis. Each of them offers different benefits. And what you're going to need to do is combine all the benefits together and find the present value of them. And then the same thing with the disbenefits. Here you can see in part A it says calculate the present worth for each alternative. And what I've done here is I've kind of provided a structure for you to do that. So here you're going to have the initial cost of option A, which is just this. It's already in the initial. But these are not in the initial. So do you remember what function already built into Excel you can use to find the present value of some annual amount?
NPV?
You could use NPV if you had like a row of data where it's different amounts each year. But you may find it easier just to use the PV function here.
Put it in the payment field, right?
Exactly. I'm glad you said that, because this amount is a recurring amount. So you're going to put it into the payment field. It's not going to be a single future value. It's going to be that every year, for how many years is it? 75? Every year for 75 years, you're getting $52,000 worth of maintenance and operation. So for example, here, the initial cost of option A is just $3.1 million. But then the present worth of option A, annual maintenance and operation, equals PV. Okay, so the rate, I haven't filled in my rate here yet. Our MAR for this project, it says in the handout, is 6%, 0.06, 75 years. Okay, now back to PV. The rate, I'm just going to lock the reference to the MAR. NPER, lock the reference to 75 years. And now I'm going to put in this annual maintenance and operation, but it's going to be in the payment field, because what I want to do is I want to take a recurring annual amount and find the present value of it. So minus of the amount. And then what I get is $855,000 is the present value of the maintenance and operation. So do a similar thing for options B, C, D. You're going to have to put all of the benefits together and find the present worth of them together. So there's a couple of different ways to do it. I'll leave it to you to figure it out. Once you've got all of these terms, then you calculate the B to C of each. And this is kind of like our initial screening, is if each option is suitable, then we'll compare. For example, if both A and B have a conventional B to C ratio of greater than 1, then we'd compare B versus A. So the same kind of idea is that you start with the cheapest one and you compare it to the next most expensive alternative. So you can see here where I've got comparison blank versus blank. Then the delta CI would be B minus A. The delta C M&O would be B minus A. So we're finding the increment in each of these columns. Now the delta B to C, this is really important. I'd say about half the people usually make a mistake. Delta B to C is not just simply this divided by that. You need to use the formula, this formula for the delta B to C. So for this column, you're calculating the B to C ratio using the data to the left. All right, so that's all I'm going to say for now. I'll give you some time to calculate this, and then we'll reconvene and make sure everybody's got the right idea. Every one of them is acceptable because the ratio is greater than 1.
Okay.
Yeah. So they're all meeting the initial screening. So our first comparison should be B versus A. The reason why is A is the cheapest, so it's kind of like our baseline alternative. So B versus A is the first comparison.
C minus B, or do you do B minus C?
C minus B. You always do the higher initial cost minus the lower initial cost. Because all you have to do is drag it down.
Yep. But for some reason I got 146. You're supposed to do, well no, I did convention. I wonder what I'm doing wrong.
Plus, isn't it?
if different people are paying the maintenance and operation compared to the initial costs. So, like if it was the federal government was going to pay for the initial construction of something, but then a state or local government was going to handle the ongoing operations and maintenance, it might make sense in a case like that to separate the costs and put them up in the numerator instead, because usually like the local people are the ones who enjoy the benefits, they're the ones who experience the disbenefits, and also they would be the ones who are having to cough up the money for the maintenance and operation. So you're kind of localizing all of those effects in the numerator, and then the denominator is just Big Daddy federal government who's paying the initial construction cost. So that's the only thing I can figure, like would be the reason why is a modified B to C ratio might be from the perspective of a federal government looking at whether their investment is justified even when they don't have to handle the when they don't have to handle the ongoing operation expenses.
Like when we turn a dam or a flood wall over to a community.
Yeah. And typically what you'll see is that conventional B to C ratios are greater than modified B to C ratios. But it'll always be like, it won't ever be acceptable according to one and unacceptable according to another. It's just an issue, I think, of magnitude, not so much of absolute yes or no.
I have a question outside of like, it's like engineering.
Mm-hmm.
How hard is it if I were to not get a job right out of college in engineering to go back into engineering later? Is that like a thing, or is that not?
I think the longer you're out, the harder it is to get back in. But right now, there's more engineering jobs than any time that I remember as a teacher or when I was, just graduating. So I've been involved with engineering. Like I got my bachelor's degree in 2000. So 23 years ago, I got my bachelor's degree. And so in those 23 years right now is the best time to be graduating and entering the profession, I think. So maybe that gives you a little more leeway. But I think it's hard to get back in because, those technical skills that if you don't use them, you lose them.
You moved up the ladder pretty fast.
Well, I don't know if being in academia is considered up the ladder. Yeah.
You were like when I first came in here, I was like your young professor.
Oh,
And
yeah.
then I found out you were like.
Yeah.
I was like.
Not young.
Goodness gracious, what did you do again?
Oh, yeah. Well,
Where did you graduate from? What college?
I got my PhD at Purdue.
Purdue.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you go to undergrad in California? Or-
In Utah.
Utah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
In Utah. Yep, out in the
What
mountains.
city was Utah in?
Well, I was in Provo, which is south of Salt Lake City.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, so our first matchup was B versus A, and since the ratio is greater than 1, that means the more expensive alternative is better. So now we're going to compare C to B, because C is the next most expensive alternative. So we'll just find out the incremental cost, the incremental benefits. Now, what does it mean when the incremental disbenefit is negative? What does that mean? So disbenefits are bad things, right? So these options have less disbenefits the more expensive they are. So I don't know what option A is, but whatever it is, it's like tearing up people's yards and giving them lots of noise pollution and causing lots of delay. It may be cheap to construct, but it's inflicting disbenefits on people. And so the fact that the disbenefit is negative makes sense because it's a bad thing. And so when you're getting a more expensive option, the disbenefit increment being negative just means the more expensive option has less disbenefits. So it's the negative of a negative thing. So the incremental benefit to cost ratio is going to be the benefits minus the disbenefits, which is going to be basically adding the incremental disbenefits since it's negative to the benefits, and then adding together. All right, so what's the interpretation of the ratio being less than 1? So since delta B to C is less than 1, that means that option C isn't justified. $1 in cost only yields 96 cents in additional value. So we wouldn't want to spend $1 and only get 96 cents back. That's a bad return on investment. So we're throwing out option C, and so option B is still kind of our champion for now, and our last matchup is option D versus option B. So it is D minus B, and I guess we do that for all of these. You just pull it sideways, and I can pull this one down. All right, so since delta B to C is greater than 1, that means the extra cost for option D compared to option B is justified. Our final best option is D. So the conclusion, which alternative is best, is option D. So we have to do this sequential matchup one at a time. We don't know up front what all of the options are going to be. It's not going to always be B versus A, then C versus A, then D versus A, because we may end up throwing out option A in the first comparison. Okay, what about this? Question 2. What is the highest interest rate that could be used and still have an alternative that is acceptable, that has an acceptable B to C ratio? So part of whether this project is viable depends on the interest rate, because all of these benefits are in the future, and if we have high interest rate, what that means is that those future benefits are discounted more heavily to the present. So it makes it more difficult to justify spending a lot of money now if the benefits in the future are being discounted heavily. So right now the project, all of these projects are acceptable if we have an interest rate of 6%. But what this question is asking here, what is the highest interest rate that could be used and still have an alternative that has an acceptable B to C ratio? So if we change the interest rate, what is the highest interest rate we can have and still see one of these that's acceptable? So like if we go from 7%, from 6 to 7, our B to C ratios are getting worse because those good reasons that we're doing the project, the benefits, are being discounted more heavily as the interest rate goes up. So what about 8%? We still have all of them acceptable. What about 10%? Now we're just down at the threshold where option D is barely acceptable right now, but if we have to pay 11% to borrow money, suddenly both option C and option D are no longer viable. Look at option B, seems to be the one that's holding on the longest. If we go to 13%, now B is the only option that's still valid if we have to borrow money at 13%. So what it's asking in that question is, how high can you go with the interest rate? What's the highest interest rate? What is the highest interest rate that still gives us some option that is acceptable? Okay, it's going to be this one. So let me do a goal seek now. Data, what if analysis, goal seek. So our objective is to set this B to C ratio to 1 by changing the MAR. Okay, so we let it go, and what we have is, it says 14.5%. If I increase the precision here a bit, 14.5% still gives me option B is acceptable. By the way, I'm sorry I didn't offer this suggestion earlier. We should create a copy so that we have the answers to question 1 on one of the tabs. So right down here at the bottom, if I right-click, create a copy. So then I'll make this one the interest rate, and then this one like question 1. Okay, so question 1, the interest rate was 6%. So now we're all the way back to like answering the first question. And then for the second question was where we were trying to find, playing around with the interest rate, which gives us some acceptable option. So option B is acceptable. If our interest rates keep going up, then it changes what we should do. So when the interest rate was 6%, that tells us option D is best, but things can change. And so think about what's happened with interest rates here in our American economy over the last 18 months. People were able to borrow money for houses at like 3 or 4% a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. You could borrow money for just historically low rates. But now interest rates are much higher than they used to be. The government isn't having to pay like a huge increase in interest to finance its projects. Well, at least not the federal government. There may be some states that have been affected by the increase in interest rates. But the main point that I wanted to make with this second question here is just that which option is best is sensitive to the interest rate. And so in the real world, if you find yourself doing a project like this and you've decided which alternative your company should select or your agency should select, when interest rates fluctuate, it may make one of the alternatives better. Any questions about the example? Ben?
This is pretty hypothetical, so I'm just curious. So you have a B to C ratio of 0.99999.
Yeah.
I know that typically we would round that answer, but I'm thinking that you wouldn't round it because then you would have 99 cents for every dollar. So it's safe to say that we should not round our B to C answer.
Yeah, unless, now think about, you have to ask yourself the question, who was it that was turning the benefits into dollars? Was it somebody who's really optimistic? Is it somebody who wants the project to go forward no matter what, and so they're going to kind of be exaggerating the value of the benefits? Well, in a case like that, definitely don't do the project. But if it's someone who's trying to like argue the project isn't justified and they're always going to be underestimating the true economic value of the benefits, then maybe you'd say, well, it's right on the borderline, but I'm going to do it anyway because I think that these people are being too pessimistic about quantifying the benefits. For instance, sometimes they say that the economic value of avoiding delay is only $13 an hour. And I think just about everybody's time is worth more than $13 an hour. So I don't know. It's a little bit subjective, but like if everything's been quantified and monetized exactly correctly, then you're right. You shouldn't round up to 1, and therefore you should reject a project if the B to C ratio is 0.99999.
Okay.
Yeah. Great question. Are there any others before we wrap up for today? So where are you going to see me next? Drinko Library 349. Thursday at 4 o'clock. I'll take attendance. I don't know, maybe depending on what we learn that day, whether the material will be on an exam, maybe, it's possible. So feel free to take notes. And if you have any questions on the homework that's due tomorrow, then let me know, or the homework that goes along with this one, if we look at the course content for today. Oh boy.
I don't like the new blackboard.
Oh yeah. it sometimes confuses me. Here we go. So the homework for today, you've just got the paper copy of it, but there's just a single problem, and I mean, maybe do it tonight while it's still fresh in your mind, right? You've got the template. It's very similar, but I've been tricky. How am I being tricky here? Can you see the trick?
The initial costs aren't organized in order.
Good. That's exactly right. So you need to always start at the cheapest. So your first matchup is going to be second cheapest versus cheapest. So I intentionally scrambled that just a little bit to hopefully make you reinforce that memory message that you always need to be sensitive to. I mean, sometimes the data is given out of order, and you have to organize it.
Can I use your template?
Sure. Yeah. But let me say, I noticed in the last homework assignment, a few people I think had used the template from an example, but didn't change all of the data to reflect the problem that actually was being solved. Like maybe the external rate of return example we did in class had 13 years, but the homework only had 11 years. So be careful when you're using one template in another situation. You got to update everything. So just be sensitive about that. All right, I'll see you on Thursday over in the library. Oh, Jace.
For just at the end of this month, for graduate,
Mhm.
exam that we have,
Yeah.
like